Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
How are you, sir?
Very good. It's morning at your side, right? 8 a.m.
Exactly, sir.
Yeah.
Almost 9 a.m.
Almost 9 a.m. Oh, that's just nice. So we're just gonna give the guys maybe 1 minute to scan the QR code and then.
And how are the things there? Is everything fine?
Yeah, just nice. Same with the rest of the world, still struggling with this COVID, but can't complain. It's the same everywhere. So
yes, sir. It's a never-ending story.
Yeah. All right. So I think that gave them enough time to scan the QR code. So our next session is Azure SQL Managed Instance, a different SQL Server from Gonzalo Bissio. Gonzalo is a CSE for Data and AI for Microsoft Argentina. He's also a frequent speaker for Argentina SQL PASS chapter. I don't know what the user group is now called now that SQL PASS is gone.
Yes, it's still SQL Argentina, our main group.
Yeah.
But somehow we are trying to change the name and somehow trying to say, hey, I mean, we need to change this. But as of now, it's still SQL Argentina.
That's nice. So yeah, so I won't hold I won't hold the session much. I'll let you have the floor, and then we can start with your session.
Sure.
All right.
Do you want to start now, or do you want to still give a couple of minutes to the people just to get some coffee, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, I think you can start now. It's already 8 p.m. Everyone should have been back by now.
Are you still recording, or do you want to start it?
Yeah, it's still recording.
Okay. So let's start. First of all, Pio, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much for organizing this kind of events. As we spoke before, we have our team groups, and it is amazing just to have at least in a monthly basis. So first of all, congratulations and thank you very much again for having me. Today we are going to, I mean, every time that I present different sessions, I'm trying to answer the question that I receive in a daily basis. One of the questions is, hey, I mean, this is a new service. I mean, first of all, I have one monitor here and the other one there. So I'm seeing here because I'm seeing the questions. That is why you will see me switching between these different monitors. This is one of the questions that I receive very frequently, honestly. It's a different SQL. I mean, we hear about Azure SQL Database, we hear about Azure SQL MI. It's a service, and sometimes we are getting questions on, okay, hey, will this be different? Will I have to change a bunch of stuff in my applications or my interfaces or my processes? And I will try to respond this question. First of all, I will introduce myself. I am Gonzalo Bissio from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Actually, I'm working as a customer engineer in Microsoft for different customers in Latin America, US, Europe, etc., etc. There you have my contact, my blog. In case that you need anything, just feel free to send me an email, and I will try to help you as much as I can. Let's talk about the agenda. We will talk about a little introduction about the service itself. What are the news? What is coming? Migration to Azure SQL MI, limitations, among other stuff. Are you using Azure SQL MI? Are you using Azure Cloud? Yes, no. You can answer on the chat. Maybe you can say yes, you can say no. Are you thinking on start using the cloud? That is something that I would like to hear. Yes, no. Because that is something that we frequently ask among our different customers. Hey, are you going to use the cloud? Yes, no. But I'm not seeing answers. So Azure SQL, nice, Annie, come on. And Azure SQL is Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL MI? Or both? Still on-prem, nice, thank you. Okay, so no SQL Database, nice. So today you're going to hear about different stuff, but maybe this can help you. So this is the family. This is the Azure SQL family. This is how Microsoft named these new services. The first one is VMs. So you have a server in on-premises or let's say other cloud provider. Well, you can have the same VM in Azure. Then we have managed instance, the one that we are going to talk today, and Azure SQL Database, in where you can have single databases, elastic pool, and hyperscale databases. So let's see, we have different options. For example, on the managed instance side, we can have single instances. Remember the concept of instance. Let's say that you want to have almost the same instance that you have on-prem or you have in infrastructure as a service. Well, you can have almost the same here in managed instance. If you want to almost have 100% of compatibility with your existing server, well, this will be one of the options in where you can have multiple databases inside an instance. You can have services such as SQL Server Agent or like doing cross-database queries, which is not supported in Azure SQL Database. Well, it is what you need, an external service, Elastic Jobs, Elastic Queries in order to achieve that. So if you want to have everything on the same box, well, you can use Azure SQL MI. In sample, I am going to talk this about later. Then we have our Azure SQL Database. I mean, these one are the PaaS or Platform as a Service options. Platform as a Service, meaning that you have the platform, you don't need to worry about OS, security, patches. I mean, everything will be patched on the latest version. In fact, Azure SQL MI or Azure SQL Database will be under a new version of SQL Server. I mean, here, Microsoft is testing the new cumulative updates first. In Azure SQL Database, you have single database. If you want to have a single database and that's it, you can store up to, well, now 16 terabytes in a public preview. Or in hyperscale, you can host up to 100 terabytes in case that you need to have a very large database and you don't want to use SQL pools and you want to use Azure SQL Database. Well, hyperscale is your option. Also, we have serverless and this autonomous database between quotes, I would say, in where the service will auto scale based on demand. I mean, you can configure a max number of CPUs, a minimum, and the service automatically will be using based on the demand that the service has. After 1 hour, if you're not using the service, boom, it will be paused automatically. And obviously, this will be charged per second based on the compute that you're using. On the other hand, we have the provision, the normal one, which will be charged by hour, but you will be charged by everything that you're using, vCores or DTUs. And then we have the concept of elastic pooling, where I would say a number of databases are sharing resources. It's like the concept of resource governor, but in a service level. You can have, let's say, 10 databases, and you can assign, I don't know, 8 cores or 8 vCores to the elastic pool, and those 8 vCores will be shared by all of the databases. That's it. So let's talk about Azure SQL MI. Obviously, it will be built on the same infrastructure as Azure SQL Database, the same benefits, automatic backups. But as I mentioned before, we have some things that Azure SQL Database does not support. For example, cross-database queries, as I mentioned, for example, jobs, for example, I mean, for the ones who loves transactional replication, well, it will be supported here. As, I don't know, publisher, distributor, subscriptions, everything will be supported here in Azure SQL Database only. Acting as a subscription is supported here, everything is supported. Service broker, in case that you want to change, I don't know, database options, in case that you want to add more file groups for partitioning, well, you can do that here. But the most important thing, at least for me, one very critical thing, which is this one here, native backup and restore. Honestly, sometimes working in migrations to this kind of services can be challenging. And it will be more challenging if you're using Azure SQL Database, because if you have, let's say, a 1 terabyte database and you want to migrate that database to Azure SQL Database, sometimes creating backpacks, which is the way on how to migrate, will take time. Even though if you use database migration services, you will be creating a backpack behind bars. or you can move the data manually. But I mean, if you need to move something from on-premises to Azure, always the recommendation is to move the database to Azure first and then do the data movement, but that will take time. Native backup, that means you can restore it to an on-prem? No. Officially, the answer is no. Is the product team working on add some improvements there? Yes. Maybe in the future we can have this on where we can move Azure SQL MI backups from the cloud to on-prem. It will be awesome. But as of now, no, you can just execute your own backups in Azure SQL MI. You can leave them in a blob storage, but you can't restore them officially to SQL on-prem or EAS. But in case that you want to move from on-prem or from EAS to Azure SQL MI, you can execute a backup and then restore it directly on the service, meaning that even if you want, for example, one of the recommendations always to migrate to the cloud is to split the backup in 10, 20, 30, I don't know, 30, 40 pieces, and then copy one by one so you don't use all the network. And in case that something happened in the middle, you don't need to start from scratch. And you can do that in case that you want to break the backups in different pieces. But talking about migrations, honestly, this option for me is the best. It's the easiest way to move the database from on-prem to the cloud. We will talk about migrations later. I'm going to talk about some new improvements, but as of now, answering your question, no. Again, as I mentioned, cross database queries. You know this, that in Azure SQL Database you cannot do like select star, or let's say better, select column A, column B from table A, join table B. Well, this will not work in Azure SQL Database, but it will be in Azure SQL MI. Obviously, all the security features, SQLation, in case that you are using DB or database email to send you alerts, well, you can use this that here. As I mentioned, service broker, transactional replications, well, change that data capture now is enabled in Azure SQL Database. It is using something called Azure Scheduler, but I mean, you will be able to use this in Azure SQL Database as well. Well, DMB, extended events, blah, blah, blah. Another very important thing which is enabled also in Azure SQL Database is Query Store. Are you familiar with this amazing feature? Yes, no. Are you using today for troubleshooting query problems? Yes, no. This is one of my favorite. Yes, nice. Come on, easy. Great news. Query Store is a feature that was built back in SQL 2016. It's a feature that will help you to Lena. No, okay, I will show you in a few. It's a feature that will help you to identify all the queries that are running on your system. You don't need to, for example, create an extended event session for the profiler lovers. You don't need to do that anymore. You can enable this, which is enabled by default in Azure SQL MI and Azure SQL Database. This is a query store, as the name it is. This will show you, I will show you in a few on a demo. For example, how many plans your query is using, what is the execution plan, some metrics about the query executions, etc., etc. This is amazing. This is enabled by default, and you don't need to do anything, which is amazing. SQL Server compatibility, almost 100%. Things that doesn't work here. For example, if you're using file stream or file tables, as of now, that feature is not supported. If you're using SQL 2019 and you want to use the new in-memory TempDB tables, that feature will not work. But for the rest, everything is supported. Isolation and security, very important thing. So Annie, if you're using Azure SQL Database, maybe this is something that you have to deal with, which is that Azure SQL Database is open to internet. So by default, you can connect to the service. Obviously, you need to create a firewall rule. You need to configure a VNet if you don't want to have single IPs. But by default, the service will be open to internet. Sometimes this is not good for companies. For security policies, they don't want to have anything open to internet. If you want to avoid that, you need to use something called private links, in where you need to configure a DNS. Obviously, that will give you an internal IP, and you will have connectivity only if you have a VPN site to site or if you have an express route. So this will not be open to internet, but you need to configure that. On the other hand, Azure SQL MI by default is close to internet, which is amazing. You will use a special VNet for Azure SQL MI, which is great because if you want to connect, for example, your service, you can create an additional subnet inside the Azure SQL MI VNet, or you can configure what is called peer-to-peer, I would say, in where you peer to different VNets in order to open connections, which is awesome. So by default, this is not open to internet. Another, I would say, good point for Azure SQL MI. Talking about authentication, this is very important because, I mean, I hear a bunch of companies saying, hey, Gonzalo, I migrate my database to Azure SQL MI and the connection is not working. Why? Because we are using Windows authentication. Will Windows authentication work? The answer is no. What will work? Azure Active Directory authentication. For example, if you are using MFA or multi-factor authentication, that will work. If you are using groups, if you are using users, and if you configure Azure Active Directory, which means that you will be copying your on-premises Active Directory to the cloud, you can use, but only that authentication method. If you use Windows authentication, this will not work. Important thing, starting December, if you are using an older Management Studio version, let's say older than 18, Azure Active Directory authentication will not work anymore. So be careful, keep your Management Studio updated because starting December, this will not work anymore. Or the other thing, if you don't want to use Azure Active Directory for the authentication part, if you want to use, for example, manage identities for your different services, you can use SQL authentication, all method. I mean, sometimes that is not, I would say, recommended. Well, you can use Azure Key Vault in order to store the password, just get the secret from the Key Vault just to add a security layer in the middle, but I would prefer to use Active Directory or Azure Active Directory. VNet, this one, what I mentioned, just in case you are not familiar with the VNet concept, is virtual private network. Or VNet is virtual network. It will be the same concept as NIC in on-premises. So every time that you hear VNet is virtual network. So if you hear me saying, hey, VNet, or we are opening the VNet, it's like you are creating the rules to open the connection between two different subnets, I would say. So here, as I mentioned, by default, Azure SQL MI will be part of a virtual network or VNet, and it will be isolated from the internet, which is amazing. And the only way to access is through ExpressRoute or site-to-site VPN. Size options. Well, Annie, maybe you are familiar with this, but here we can have only two options. In Azure SQL Database, you can use DTUs or beakers. Well, here we can use beakers, but we can choose on the beakers side, we can use general purpose or business critical. The difference between them, well, first of all, is that your service, so there is no need for private endpoint. No, you don't need to have private endpoint here. In Azure SQL Database, yes, but in Azure SQL MI, no, because by default it will be closed. Unless you configure a public endpoint, which is not recommended, but in case that you need, you can open the service to internet. This will use the port 3342, which is not 1433, so you will have to open all of the rules to this port, but you don't need to have this. Okay, general purpose. One of the differences is about that the service will not have the storage attached directly to each of the servers. So you will have remote storage account to host your database files. Actually, the maximum number of database files allowed here is 280 per database. I mean, that is not normal, but maybe it can happen to you. In business critical, you have the limit of 32,767 files, which is a default in infrastructure as a service or on premises. But again, the storage will be remote. You will not have local storage. The number of IOPS here depends on the size of the database. So there is a table in where you will see that based on, for example, from 0 to 512, you will have, I can't remember the number, but I think it's that 200 IOPS. Then if you increase the file size, you will have more IOPS, but obviously you will have to assign more storage to the service. The other difference is about the internal HA. I call this internal HA, but this is the high availability configuration that you get by default if you choose general purpose, meaning that you have the active compute nodes, the active VMs, and if something happened to any of these VMs, you will have some redundant nodes that will come up if something happened to one of these VMs. Let's say that this one has any problem, automatically this one will go to the active compute node. It will change the status. This movement will give you downtime, absolutely. It will be a couple of seconds. It will be like a failover. But by default, you have these redundant nodes. I will show you in a few what will you have in business critical. Other difference is obviously the memory per vCore. Also, there is a table we say, hey, you have, I can't remember if it was like 4 GB per vCore. I can't remember exactly the number. And lately, the temp DB size, here it will be attached to the number of vCores that you choose. Here you have the number. So if you choose, for example, 8 vCores, you can have up to, I can't remember exactly the number. I think that it's 80 GB of temp DB. I can't remember exactly the number. Oops. So now let's go to business critical. Let me just, okay. So this is business critical tier here. As you can see, we have directly the storage attached to each of the nodes, meaning that we will have a better throughput and a better performance. As you can see here, we have a different image. Here we have an availability group. This is by default. You don't need to touch anything. So once you choose business critical, automatically the service will create this. You have a benefit here that if you want to offload your reads, for example, the read-only mechanism that you use in on-premises, you will be able to use it here, which is the read-only endpoint. You will have to use exactly the same parameters that you are using in on-premises, application intent read-only, initial catalog, the database name, and automatically your connection will be redirected here. One of the questions can be, hey, Gonzalo, do I need to configure anything? No, this is by default. Automatically, if you use application intent read-only, initial catalog, database name, boom, it will be redirected to here. Do you have any extra cost? No. Do you have the same resources on the secondary replica? Yes. If you choose, for example, 8 cores here, you will have the same here. Will this impact the primary? Well, you know that in availability groups, if you have a bunch of reads on the secondary, that can impact the synchronization. So you know that. So think about availability group, think about the problems that you can have in availability group. Well, here is the same. But in case that you want to offload your reads to the secondary, you can do that without any extra cost, and you can have the same resources. So if you want to remove some load from the primary, well, you can move this to the secondary. For example, can you execute failovers? The answer is yes, you can. You can use PowerShell in order to execute the failover from the primary to the secondary. That would be awesome. There is another flag. Do you get a listener name or just the initial MI server name? Just the initial MI server name. You can use exactly the same endpoint. I will show you auto failover group, which is a different stuff. Well, it will be the same behind bars, but I mean, we are not configuring anything here. This is by default, but you can use the same host name that you see on the portal in order to do this. So talking about max storage here. So in general purpose, we have maximum of 8 terabytes, as you can see here, but there is a public preview of 16 terabytes. So if you want to test that, you can do that. In business critical, we have up to 4 terabytes, and that's it. And also here, the TempDB is not attached to the number of vCores that you configure initially. So here, the TempDB will share the total service storage. So be careful, because in case that you are doing the sizing for the service, you need to count how much space TempDB will use. So be careful with that. I will stop. Any other question? Because first of all, thank you very much for the question. I love questions. So do you have any other questions? I am not seeing anything now, but I want to do like a quick stop. No? Okay. Again, something that we care a lot in on-premises. You don't imagine how many companies I see today saying, I don't have backups, because the backups consume space, because the backup consumes services, because the backup consume resources, etc., etc. And every time that I hear this, I say, hey, what will happen if you execute an update without where, or a delete where you don't need to? What will happen? You will lose data, right? Okay, so do your backups. The good thing here is that the backups are automated. You don't need to care about backups. The backups will happen every 5 to 10 minutes. Here you will see, if you want to check this, you can use extended events in order to get whether the backups are happening or not. This is not possible yet in Azure SQL Database. So if you want to monitor your backups, you will not be able in Azure SQL Database, but in Azure SQL MI, you will be using extended events. Another thing that I mentioned before, you can execute your own backups to a blob storage. Sometimes we have some legal requirements that, hey, I need to have my backup in an on-premises location, because that is a legal regulation that we need to follow. Okay, you can execute your backup with copy only. You can download using a seed copy command line, and you can save it in on-premises. That's it. Another thing that it's in public preview is that something in Azure SQL Database is in GA since a bunch of time, which is the long-term backup retention. You can save your backups up to 10 years. You can choose the weekly backup or the monthly backup to be saved for 10 years. The minimum retention is 1 day, the maximum is 35, unless you want to have the long-term backup retention, meaning that this will have extra costs. So, in case that you are doing the, or how much will cost this, be careful in case that you need to have the backup for more than 35 days. Or, as I mentioned, you can execute your own backups to upload storage and keep them there. That's it. Some restore considerations. For example, I saw this a bunch of times. What will happen if you have more than one transaction log? Will this work? The answer is no. Obviously today, except for the reason that you get out of a space, you don't need to have more than one transaction log. In case that you have it, just before you execute the restore, you will have to remove that second file and some other things. High availability. We mentioned the default one for general purpose, for business critical. But in case that you want to have a secondary replica outside or to another region, because you have the requirement on that you will have, by default, you need to have 2 different regions. You can use something called auto-failover groups that I'm going to talk in a few. In case that you need to replicate some data, you can use transactional replication. For example, if you are using data sync today to have different groups, that is not supported in Azure SQL MI, just in case you are thinking of using this feature in order to copy data from one side to another. This will not be possible. Obviously, log shipping, mirroring, that stuff is not supported. But you can execute or create something called auto-failover group. So here, responding to Christian, here you will have a listener because this one is something that you are configuring from one region to a secondary region, let's say from North Europe to West Europe, or from East US to West US, etc., etc. So here, yes, we have something. I mean, it is the same technology. It's availability group from one region to another one. Here you have the read-write listener, but here you will not be able to use the parameters that we used before for the read routing. You can use directly the read-only listener. Here you have a read-only listener in order to redirect the reads to the secondary. Very important thing, since we are moving data from one region to another one, this one will be async. So as you know, what will happen, the failover will allow data loss. I mean, you can manually execute failover, meaning that you will not lose data in a manual failover. But what will happen if the primary region is down? There will be a parameter that will say, okay, we will wait for 1 hour before executing the automatic failover, just to bring up the region or the service or whatever is happening. If in 1 hour Microsoft was not able to resolve this, there will be automatic failover allowing data loss. Obviously, in the middle, you can execute the failover and see if that happens. But just to mention that. Replications, I know that there are a bunch of people who loves replication. You will see that this is in preview. So if you're going to use replication, just be careful if you have any internal policy on your company saying that, hey, if the feature is not in GA, you can't use it. Well, replication, it is not yet in GA, but you can test it. Service broker, as I mentioned, database mails, in case that you are creating your own alerts, in case that you are sending some, for example, confirmation after some jobs were executed, well, you can use that. Another good thing about the cloud itself is that you can scale up or scale down if you need. Very important thing. This is not like Azure SQL Database that you create a database in 10 minutes. This is a different process. Internally, Microsoft is creating something called virtual clusters. Internally, they are creating all the infrastructure for this particular service. You need to know that I will show you that you have an endpoint, but that endpoint is pointed to something called gateway rings, in where the metadata for the service will be, for example, the connections. So let's say that we have here, for example, we have our application, and this is pointing to our Azure SQL MI. Well, how does the connection knows, for example, the node name? Well, this points first to something called here gateway rings, in which these gateway rings will have the information about the server name for the Azure SQL MI, and from this gateway ring, the connection will be redirected to the server in where the service is running. So there is a huge infrastructure behind bars, and this process will take like 3 to 6 hours. I will show you now on the portal this warning. So this will take time. In case that you need to scale up, automatically a new infrastructure will be built in case that you're adding more beacons, and then a synchronization is happening. And when the synchronization finishes, there will be downtime, which is the failover between the old infrastructure and the new infrastructure. And that's it. It will be a couple of seconds, but the entire process will take like 3 to 6 hours. So if you're having a production issue, you need to know that this will take time. The same if you're if you are doing the scale down. If you are adding more storage, this will take 10 minutes. because you are just adding more storage. But if you are adding more vehicles or doing the scale down, this will take time, but you can. This is one of the things about the cloud, that if you need resources, you can just, with 2 clicks, you can add those resources. You don't need to wait for 16 days or that stuff until the storage arrives. Here, you have everything that you need. The other good thing is that, for example, there are some companies that has, policies to change the SQL Server service account. Well, here you are forgetting about that. That is another benefit of the service. Something that I mentioned at the beginning, which is instance pool, which is in preview. This is something that you can pay for, I would say, development or staging environment, and you don't want to pay for a single managed instance because you want to share this. Well, you can use instance pool, in where you will be paying for, let's say, a general purpose 16 beaker, but internally you can have multiple instances for development purposes. If you want to have, for example, or you want to pay only 16 cores and internally use different instances, you can use this, which is amazing in case that you want to save some costs. Some news, something that I didn't mention, which is before moving to news and what is coming, something called Azure Hybrid Benefit. In Azure SQL Database, this will apply only to the beaker method, and obviously this will not apply to serverless. In Azure SQL MI, this will apply to both general purpose and business critical. There is a benefit that you can move some on-premises licenses to Azure SQL MI or Azure SQL Database. Obviously, you need to have some free, some licenses that you are not using in on-premises. There is a link that, if you're interested, I can send it to you. That you can move, for example, let's say that you pay or you choose 16 beacons. Okay, if you want to have this Azure Hybrid Benefit, you will require, for example, 4 enterprise licenses, and you will save up to 40% of the service, which is great. You will be saving some money with some licenses that you are not using on premises. So talking about news and what is coming, I am very excited about this one, log replay services. This is a technology based on, yes, log shipping. I don't know if you like log shipping, but I love log shipping to do migrations. Well, this log replay service is built on transaction, or it's built on log shipping. So if you want to do migrations almost with very small migration windows, you can use this. You can also use Azure Database Migration Services, but you can use the log replay services in order to do the synchronization between on-prem or just to managed instance. This is amazing, and you have that a bunch of, well, I will show you Azure Monitor with SQL Insight in a few. But here you have some news. Honestly, Microsoft is investing a lot. Can we define custom shops as we can do? Yes, you can. You can create your own shops. I will show you in a few. For example, if you're using something that I love, which is Ola Hallengren solution, and you want to run your maintenance there, well, you can use that solution, because in fact I deployed to my Azure SQL MI. All the news, what is coming, everything, you have the links here. Migrating. Migrations are, as I say, every time that we are migrating a system, it's a different story. If you want to migrate, there are some steps that you can follow. Here you have a link, which is datamigration.microsoft.com. On this link, let me open it because it's a very beautiful one. So here, let's say that you are moving from SQL, let's say, to Azure SQL MI, or from Oracle to Azure SQL MI. Here you can choose, depending from where you are coming, you can choose your option. Let's say that we are moving from SQL to Azure SQL MI. Here you have some recommendations, considerations, appropriate target, number of vehicles, general purpose, business critical, migration tools. You have all the information that you need here. So in case that you are preparing your migration, you can go here and see what are the recommendations. In case that you are moving from Amazon RDS or Google Cloud Compute, I mean, you can have all the information that you need. So this link is very important, datamigration.microsoft.com. Here you have all the information that you need in case that you are preparing a migration. Again, my recommendation always is to run what is called Data Migration Assistance, an application that I love. This will assess your existing database. You can choose Azure SQL MI as target. This will give you all the recommendations. Very important thing. Every time that you migrate your database from an older to a newer version, you change the compatibility level. Do you have to change it here? The answer is yes. If you migrate from an older SQL version to managed instance, you need to change the compatibility level to use the latest features. So don't forget about that, because I see a bunch of performance issues because of this. What can you use to migrate? Well, you can use Azure Database Migration Service, you can use Log Replay Services, you can use Backup Restore, whatever you want or whatever you prefer, whatever you want. Can you use Data Factory? Can you use integration services? The answer is yes. Is it recommended? The answer is no. Why? Because you can execute Backup Restore. You don't need to move the data manually. You can use Backup and Restore. And then you can move your database to Azure SQL MI. Limitations, known issues, trace flags. I love trace flags. There are some trace flags that you can enable. You will see that by default. The last time that I saw this, there were 25. Let me see how many DBCC trace status. Let's see. Yes, the same 25. Oops, sorry. I wanted to open my Zoom IT in order to show you the number. As you can see here, by default, we have 25 trace flags enabled here, as you can see in Azure SQL MI. And there are some trace flags that you can enable as well. You have the link, you can visit this. But before going to the, oops, no. Let me, yes, I am very fan of Rocky Balboa. So let's see, let's go to the portal. Let's see how can we create this. If you're not familiar with the portal, portal.azure.com, you will see this. But can you usually stay in a lower? Yes, you can. For example, you're still making changes to other deprecated features to get it ready for the latest. Yes, you can. I will show you. Since we are talking about this, let me show you. This is Azure SQL MI. Oops, again. As you can see, the icon is like an instance. See, it's like a server. It's not like Azure Database, which is a blue database. How can you connect? Well, in my case, I am using SQL Authentication because I love to recommend something, but do the opposite. Sorry for that. Sorry, I don't have Azure Active Directory configured here. How you connect? Well, it's something normal. I am on the Management Studio. Can you use Azure Data Studio? The answer is yes. In fact, I think that 1 month ago, there was a migration extension released for Azure SQL MI. So that is something that Microsoft is investing in Azure Data Studio. But if you want to use as me, Management Studio, you can. It's a normal connection. I am using 18.8, which is not the latest one, so I should upgrade this. This is, for example, properties. I will show you in a few how to create this, but since we are seeing this. So here we have our processors, our memory assigned to the service. Can I modify the memory? No, I can't. As I will show you here, you can modify this. But there are some things that you can modify, such as cost threshold, max stop, or optimize for ad hoc workloads. Let's modify them. For example, let's put 50 or 30, I would say, and I will enable the optimize. Okay, and that's it. You modify the service. And now, since Francis ask me about compatibility level. This is AdventureWorks database. I just restore it from a blob storage. As you can see, I have the files. Can I modify the autogrow? Yes, I can. Let's say that I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. You know that by default in on-premises or IaaS, the maximum size per transaction log file is 2 terabytes. This is something that it is in on-premises as well, so this is not an Azure SQL MI limitation. But here you will see that, again, I recommend something that I didn't. See, I have the old compatibility level, and I want to change it. Let's say that I want to change it to 150. Okay. And that's it. For example, you talked about the jobs. I didn't deploy the other one. I forgot it, sorry. But let's say that we want to create a job. Let's say test. And I will execute, let's say, yes, I deploy the Brent solution. Execution. And I will do select, I don't know, add version. Okay. Okay, and that's it. I created my shop. For example, I don't know if you're familiar with Blitz solution or Brent OSAR solution, one that I love, honestly. You can deploy it here. As you can see, I have all the store prop. Or for thanks demo of credit solution. No problem. And here you have, for example, who is active. If you're familiar with who is active, well, you can use that as well. SP who is active. Is active, and you can get, for example, I created a log here in order to show you that something is happening, and you can use SP who is active. For example, you want to know Blitz cache, what is going on with your procedure cache, and you want to analyze your procedure cache. You can use, as you can see, I am using Brent OSAR solution for SP who is active. You can use the same. I forgot to apply my Ola Hallengren solution. Sorry about that. So as you can see, it's the same. You have security. You can create your logins. This one is mine. You will see the same. Server role, obviously. You can assign some permissions, blah, 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 blah. Let me show you. I can't remember exactly. Let's do one thing. Because I have, let me see, because I know that I have, this one was, no, this one is 65 thing that let me see, here. Let's say that you want to execute a restore. In my case, I have let's go, because I have 5 minutes, sorry. Let's say that you want to restore a database to Azure SQL MI. What you need is an storage account and a blob storage. Basically, what you can do is just to upload your backup or copy using ACID copy PowerShell module. Here I click containers, here I click migration, and I just leave the backup of my database here. But how can I connect my instance to this blob storage? Well, I can use something called credential, and I have something called SAS or share as access signature, which will be the key, and a secret, which will be the password. And then I just need to execute this. For example, I execute restore database, boom, it will start, and that's it. Gonzalo, I want to see the status of the restore. Can I use the stat clause? No, a stat clause is not supported. You can use queries or DMVs in order to know the percentage of this restore process, but you can't use stats equals to 10 or 5 or whatever percentage you use. So I have 3 minutes. Let me show you quick the Azure SQL Monitor SQL Insight. So let's say that you want to monitor your service. Monitoring is something critical for operations team. So every time that you are releasing something, if you work on an engineer team, operations team will say, hey, I need to monitor this. I need to receive alerts. You can use SCOM or System Center Operation Manager. If you're using, that is a Microsoft tool. If you don't have SCOM, what you can use is, I mean, here we have some metrics that you can see. For example, this one is a service. So when you create the service itself, you will see this one. The endpoint that you need to use is this one, host something. As you can see here, Azure SQL MI, blah, 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 blah. This one is the host name that you need to use. I mean, here we have a bunch of things, but one of the things is metrics, in where you can monitor, for example, the max CPU consumed, let's say last 3 days, I would say. And you will see the graph on the average of CPU percentage. But let's say that you want to create some alerts because of the number of, or the percentage of CPU, etc., etc. You can create this, you can add condition, blah, blah, blah. But let's say that you want a service to monitor your own instance. This one is in preview, yet it is not in GA. It's called Azure Monitor SQL Insight. Here you can create profile for Azure VMs, for Azure SQL MI, for Azure SQL Database. This will take some time. That is why I opened this before. So let me see. You will see this one, which is Azure SQL Managed Instance. Yes, it's open. Nice. You click here, and you will see some information. So, for example, you can see resource info about the Azure SQL MI, CPU, etc., etc. Activity, something that is happening. For example, number of transactions. This is based on Grafana. In fact, in order to configure this service, you need to use a VM with Linux OS. I don't know if that will change in the future because this is in public preview, but as of now, one of the requirements is a VM. Here you have user connection, batch request, compilation. This one is the blocking that I am producing now here. Deadlocks, etc., etc. And then you can see, for example, the database space, log file, data file, etc., etc., transactions that are happening, throughput, database I/O, and in case that you want to have some metrics or specific metrics, you can open them here, as you can see here. If you want to see any specific counter, you can see it. And that's it, yes. And I am on time. So first, let me add my thank you here. But before wrapping up, do you have any final question or anything? No? Well, people, thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Pio, again for having me here. It was an honor. I hope that I can be here again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. If you receive any feedback, any question or anything, just send it to me and I will be more than happy to help.
Yeah, I think we had a lot of questions. So if anyone else have any other questions, this is your chance. Else you can fill up the evaluation form. If you have any further questions or if you have any feedback about the session. Thank you very much, Gonzalo. It was a very informative session. As you guys saw, it's almost the same. SQL Server and managed instance is pretty much the same thing. The only difference is you don't need to manage the server part when you're on an MI. So I think with that, I'd like to thank everyone who you spend their night with us tonight. So thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you, all the attendees. And next meetup, we're gonna talk about Power BI and Power BI licensing. So watch out for that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one. Bye bye.